thank you so much for joining us. We're just going to take a couple of minutes to ensure that all our attendees have the opportunity to connect in, make sure that all their technical stuff is working, and as well as our streaming links and all are properly functioning. At the outset, my deepest gratitude to Grant Thornton Bharat and of course CII for organizing this absolutely essential workshop webinar on good governance in managing related party transactions. I'm just going to cover, once we have a few more people who join in, I still see our attendees trickle in, on a bit on why this is so important and particularly essential. 2020 has been an amazingly difficult year for everybody involved. And I think the way 2021 is shaping up, especially with the advent of our public markets and everything else that is going on, this is going to be a spectacular discussion. So I think we've got a bit of quorum of people. I am going to just give a quick introduction to the topic. After that, I'm very excited to have Sri Damodaranji, who's a former chairman of SEBI as well as UTI and IDBI. We have him in conversation with Mr. Saket Mehra, who's the partner of governance and risk at Grant Thornton Bharat. And then we're going to move on to an incredible panel discussing the effective ways to adopt best corporate practices in managing RPTs from the perspective of key stakeholders like the company's management, board members, independent directors, and committee members and domain experts. And we have a wide variety of panelists, and we'll get them introduced as well, who have a deep experience in this regard. But just to sort of underline and underscore the importance of it, and I'm just going to get my screen share so we all can. So, one big thing which I wanted to contextualize it, why is India unique? And this is, and when we talk about RPT in India, there is a huge background that has happened on the way we've structured our economy, our ecosystem, compared to if we were having this conversation anywhere else in the world. Particularly, one of the major issues is that India is ranked number 163 from 190 countries in contract enforcement. And this has led to a preference of transactions with people who are trusted or controlled far more than we see in other countries. We have seen the advent of groups and mini conglomerates all across because they're trying to bridge this trust gap. They are trying to get deeper and deeper into the execution roles of their vendors and partners. There's a lack of a transparent holding structure and systems at the government level. We have so many groups in India, and everybody's a group or an association of companies, but without a group treatment for expenses and taxation, which which is very common in countries in Europe and Singapore and such, who understand that how can you have a lot of common shareholding and cross shareholding. We also have a hangover. There was a tax loophole from PGST, high corporate tax days, when end of year of adjustments were very common to bring down tax expense. And this was considered sort of a edge practice by a lot in really creating RPT opportunities and, quite frankly, governance issues. And we've had a history of terror regulations, tax terrorism being one of them, but there's a general terror regulations and enforcement, which has been disguised as anti-money laundering and anti-corrupt money, black money. And a lot of these end up focusing on RPT transactions and how have they been structured. But we've also had a lack of clear-cut and simple safe harbor guidelines across the board. I think the government has started coming out with guidelines. We've seen a lot of this going into the courts. We've seen a lot of judgments coming out in tribunals. We've seen best practices, but there isn't a cookie-cutter clear system that how do I arrange an RPT which is safe harbor, that everybody's happy, particularly when you talk about what is arm's length pricing, market pricing, and things like that. But the fears are also real. And these are the classic ones that are very well known: embezzlement by management, individuals, and promoters, particularly for public companies, repurposing of bank loans and credit lines to benefit certain individuals, It can be at very junior level, it can be very senior level, the creation of off-balance sheet operations and liabilities through multiple fundings and contracts by RPTs. Where is the protection of minority shareholders to enjoy the full profits and dividends of the company? Often this is a big fear that we have. And of course, India still remains one of those very strange environments where we still have this concept of promoter. I don't think any serious OECD country with robust public markets has a promoter concept anymore, where even a small percentage of ownership gives you outsized liability and sometimes outside management. And of course, there's been a history of using RPT transaction for off-book corruptions, bribes, and transfers. And so I'm going to leave it there. I think that should gives you sort of a very general context on why this is such an important topic. I think getting it right, particularly for those who are facing public markets and for those large companies who are dealing with a large differential number of stakeholders, is extremely important. I think one of the big things, and the benefits of course are also very clear. It gives, it creates confidence in the company and thus gives a higher valuation. The ability to sleep at night for key managers, promoters, and stakeholders, which I think is extremely important. Speed of transactions and business. If you know how you're going to structure your RPTs, you can do a lot more of them in a very safe harbor form, and you aren't pausing to call your lawyer and accountant and advisors every 2 minutes. You're giving great confidence to auditors, banks, and institutional investors, and that allows you to gain higher credit lines and a long-term credibility in the market. And of course, it gives you the confidence to stand up to any queries, any regulatory action, any enforcement action by a wide variety of agencies that might be involved in your industry. And that, I think, are true benefits that we can all seek and appreciate. I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to hand it over to Saket Mehraji. Sir, would love for you to take over and start with your moderation of the session.
Thank you, Aditya. Thank you very much for setting the context, and a very warm welcome to all of you on the webinar that we are hosting along with CII. I know corporate governance may not be the most appropriate topic to talk about in the current scenario in the given times, because this is a time when everyone is trying to overcome the global pandemic. But still, as I say, the rules of good governance apply now more than ever. What we have seen, over the last few years, that the companies who have been more risk resilient, the companies who have been able to manage or define their strategies in a manner to overcome any kind of a crisis, or maybe the companies who have a well-defined regulatory framework in place, are the companies who have been able to come over the crisis in a much faster or in a much better manner as compared to the other companies. What we've also seen that what the key differentiators really exist between a good governed company or a not so good governed company. I think Aditya really alluded to the fact that yes, there's a group structure which is so common in India, but I think what you've seen that apart from those key differentiator, what really makes a difference in our view particularly is the extent of communication that the company is willing to have with its stakeholders. And when I say stakeholder, it's a much larger definition than only the shareholders. It's also about the customers, my vendors, the employees, more importantly. So I think that's one very important aspect which really differentiates a good governed company with a not so good governed company. The other important aspect is more in terms of the reporting and the disclosure. So how much are the companies really willing to disclose to the external world? And we have seen how the companies globally, as well as in India also now, are moving towards integrated reporting. So that's the other differentiating factor. And last but not the least is more about how do we build some kind of a social capital around us. I mean, it's not only the financial numbers, it's more about the social capital. How much are we really, making our employees benefited, making or protecting the interest of the employees from the environment, from the health concerns, is something which really differentiates, the good governed companies. And to dwell upon on these important aspects of corporate governance and the other related issues, nothing gives me, greater pleasure than to have with us somebody whom I have admired a lot personally, And I would like to personally call him as a gatekeeper of good governance. Mr. Damodaran, very warm welcome. We all are so privileged to have you with us today. And I'm sure that a lot of people, who are part of this webinar today are going to gain a lot of insights from the discussion that we are going to have with you. So thank you, sir. Thanks for joining us. Um, Very warm welcome again.
Thank you. My privilege.
Thank you. Sir, I would like to start with you asking, a very general question, around governance, what we have seen, uh, that over the years, it has evolved very significantly in India. I mean, we are talking about board evaluation procedures. We are talking about proficiency test for the independent directors. There is also a talk about segregation of roles between the managing director and the chairman, so on and so forth. And it's good to see really how these things have actually have actually evolved over the years. But one thing which I want to ask you is more about the communication part. In terms of, particularly in terms of crisis, what really becomes important is how much and how well are we communicating with the larger stakeholders, as I talked about. So, what's been your experience that in the times of crisis, how has India Inc. responded to transparency and disclosure? When they reported their results or when they reported it to the external world.
Thank you, Saket, for having me in this conversation. It's a good question that you're starting with, and let me give you the good news that most companies have communicated far better, far more frequently, and far more meaningfully than they have done in the past. In some sense, one of the unintended consequences of COVID could be that persons had to communicate. You couldn't reach out on a person-to-person basis, and therefore a whole lot of communication addressed to every set of stakeholders has been witnessed across companies, big, small, no matter in which sector they're. And the quality of communication, I look at communication, especially in difficult times. You alluded to that in these times, communication becomes more critical. I look at communication through a lens of 5 C's. Is that communication clear? Is it concise? It shouldn't be very elaborate. Is it correct? Is it complete? And is it contemporaneous? If you tick those 5 boxes, then your communication is serving the purpose it is intended to serve. You have many people that have taken advantage of language, pretended to communicate by putting out statements that actually don't communicate, that mislead, that confound, that confuse, largely because the intention was never to communicate, but to go through the motions of communication. I think communication is critical. Communication is what promotes transparency. It is what is fundamental to a regime premised on disclosures. So the good news is, I think we've communicated reasonably well. You can always point to a few outliers and say, they haven't done enough, they should have done better. It's possible. It's possible. But when you have a few thousand listed entities and more than a lakh of unlisted entities seeking to reach out to stakeholders, some will fall short. Some intentionally, some because they didn't get it right, not that the intentions were not honorable. I think the track record is reasonably good, but it's always work in progress. You may be better tomorrow and the day after than you today.
Just one related point, Mr. Damodaran, if I may ask. I remember being a part of one of the sessions last year in Mumbai. I think it was somewhere around this time of the year, where it was much deliberated about investor education also. So this is also something which is linked to communication. When we talk about communication with the larger stakeholder, a very pertinent topic or very pertinent aspect is the investor education. You think that also is something which you have seen as going up over the last few years, and particularly in the times of the crisis, which is very important?
Interesting you asked this. I had on the 26th of November, which is the day we would have had our governance summit, which I think you attended last year. On the 26th November, because of COVID-induced difficulties in travel, etc., I chose to do a one-on-one session with Ajay Tyagi, the chairman of SEBI. And I asked him precisely this question. This was my first question to him. Are we doing enough for investor education? It's one thing shoring up the funds available, the corpus available for investor protection. It's only an educated investor who gives himself or herself the best protection. Everything else is additional. The problem in India is that we do not have enough, and I think SEBI is doing its best. They started a series called SMARTS, where they are sending out trained persons to educate people on investment possibilities. We do not have, for a country of our size and diversity, enough investment advisors who can sit across the table and tell you what's good for you. Customize an investment plan. What we've had for years are product pushers who are masquerading as investment advisors, who will actually tell you that a product is great because they're looking at it from the point of what's in it for me. So I will give you a product if you are an unsuspecting investor saying this is a great product because I get more fees or whatever out of that. And that was not contributing to investor education. I think investor education, investor awareness of what he or she ought to know has certainly increased over time. Is that translating to the right investment decisions at the right time? There is a way to go. Some people will learn only from their experience. When they come to grief, they will learn quickly. I'm fond of saying this, that, if your investment decisions are driven by greed, remember in the dictionary, grief is only 2 pages away from greed. You don't have to travel very far. I think things are being done. I think there is communication to them. There is less complexity in the communications to them that they're not frightened. Still some way to go. We will get there, I'm sure.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. I think, sir, very rightly pointed out, because if I look at the underlying theme that we have today for our for the webinar, which is more around the related party transactions, communication becomes absolutely important from a disclosure point of view of the related party transactions as well. And this goes to the fact that when an investor typically looks at whether to invest or not to invest, this is one very critical aspect which does come into consideration. And this is one aspect which catches the eyeballs of not only the investors but also the regulators. More importantly, regulators, the auditors, everyone. And over the years, yes, there has been, significant changes, be it from a Companies Act standpoint, be it from a SEBI LODR standpoint, or be it from an accounting standard standpoint, with respect to related party transactions. But my question to you would be that what's been your experience that when we have witnessed so many cases, so many instances of violation of these provisions, what do you think that the disclosure of related party transactions in India Inc., what really restricts the companies to make adequate disclosures? Is it really the fear of scrutiny by the regulators which restricts them? Or is it also the dilution of the promoter's wealth, potentially, which also comes into consideration as to why the companies are not disclosing the way they should be disclosing?
I think your question is premised on the belief that there is a reluctance to disclose related party transactions. Let me tell you the way I look at it. The first thing, related party transactions are not necessarily bad. There are some related party transactions which are beneficial to the company. All that you got to ensure is that the potential conflict of interest that resides in a related party transaction must be addressed. How do you address that? And I think the law has put in place the 2 tests that it must pass. It must be in the ordinary course of business. I cannot enter into a transaction to humor a related party if that transaction not being relevant to my requirements. That's the first. The second, If you believe that transaction is the ordinary course of business, clearly I cannot pay a disproportionately high price to that related party. I could have sourced that product or service at a much cheaper. And therefore you get arm's length price. Now, over the years, I think audit committees that have been tasked to take a final call on this have figured out how you look at this, the more problematic of the two elements, which is arm's length pricing. Much easier to deal with ordinary courses. But audit committees have figured that out, looking at who are the other potential suppliers or vendors that can give you this, how long have they been around, is there assurance that there will be no disruption in the supplies, is the quality right, is the pricing right, and what good companies are doing, while recognizing that RPTs are not necessarily bad, is to address the perception issue, carving out a portion of a purchase order and giving it to an unrelated party to test out him or her. You can't completely go the other way because you don't know whether you will get supplies in time. And one of you have tried that, stop giving orders to related parties, gone elsewhere, and then come to grief. So related party transactions, if you take the right precautions, and if the audit committee does its job well, does its job seriously, I don't think related party transactions are a major problem. It is a manifestation of a potential conflict of interest. It is for the audit committee and also for the management at the first cut to decide, are we doing the right thing? Because today, I think there is far more scrutiny, far more examination, far more critical insights, and it's not easy to escape. So I don't think companies are trying to do this in a hush-hush kind of way. And we live in an era of disclosures and transparency. You'll get caught out if you don't disclose in time. That will get. The good news again, and you know, when you talk in terms of corporate governance in India, somehow we tend to be exceedingly self-critical. You hear people talk about how it is very good in the Western world and how it is terrible here. And then, you know, I was asked once by somebody, isn't Satyam representative? And I said, it is as representative as Enron, WorldCom, Global Crossing, Parmalat, and all of that. And I gave him about 10 names. If that is representative, yes, maybe Satyam is representative. After that, he backed off. I don't think we are badly off. There is an excellent study that's been done by Pradeep Ramakrishnan, who's the general manager at SEBI, looking at disclosure requirements in India and disclosure requirements in the US under forms 10K and 20F. And it's demonstrated that our disclosures are in respect of critical parameters far more comprehensive than what the forms in the US require. And yet, you know, absent that knowledge, we would believe the US has greatest disclosure standards and we are falling short. So I think there are, as I said in response to your earlier question, there are problem cases. There are some that will give us a bad name. The good practices never make it to the newspapers. And some companies are getting a governance premium for doing things right.
Yeah, no, I remember, a quote which you made, Mr. Damodaran, that laws are written for bad people and not for the good people.
Yes, but they apply to the good people too.
They apply to the good people too. True. Absolutely. Well, a related one, sir. I mean, now in the current scenario, if we look at when the revival is on the cards, we are seeing, the certain lead indicators again inching towards revival, be it estimation of the contraction of the GDP, which has been given by many agencies. We are seeing a lot of liquidity also being there in the system. Do you think that the companies which have been demonstrating good governance, companies which have been managing risk more effectively, and the companies who have been actually been able to showcase that to the external world, that in spirit they follow the governance norms truly, are the ones who are best placed to tap the opportunities which lie ahead for all of us?
Short answer is absolutely yes. The real issue is, and I think there is enough evidence to show, that corporate governance is a necessary condition. It might not be a sufficient condition. You need products, you need markets, you need all of that. You need to run your business well. But corporate governance is a necessary condition for sustained corporate performance. If the governance is not right, you may have a couple of good years, but you won't last. You will fall by the wayside, like, in the marathon race, several people drop off in between. Those can be equated to the guys that started well, had a couple of good years, and then fell by the wayside. Companies that practice good governance certainly are the ones that are able to stay the course. Risk is critical, and I think there is a better understanding of the importance of it, as distinct from a better understanding of the risks. I think the awareness of risk, the awareness that risk can hit you hard if you don't watch out, is higher, much higher today in Indian boardrooms. Understanding all of what constitutes risk, is that good enough? No, long way to go again. But again, companies that factor in an understanding of risk, identification of risk, anticipation of possible risk, put in place the right mitigation measures, monitor mitigation measures closely, and most important to your question, identify the opportunities that arise in a situation where everybody is sort of facing the difficulties. They are the ones that will emerge victorious in this particular battle. At the end of the day, the boards have to measure it. The boards have to be good measures. You mentioned proficiency test at the beginning. I believe it's a terrible step, and I don't know why we went that way. It will only tell people what forms they need to fill. It will not tell them how you behave in a boardroom, how you contribute to decision making. It certainly won't do that. But a good board, understanding risk, looking beyond risk at the opportunities that are being thrown up, and positioning itself at the same time, in a situation of crisis, handholding management, giving management the comfort that we have your back, what you think is right, and we will support you if we think it is right. I think those are really the way good corporates do. At the end of the day, I think if you look at the top 50, the top 100, the market cap, look at where they were 5 years ago in terms of governance, where are they now? The fact that they are in that list, that in the share market, they command a premium. There is more respect outside. Investors are actually having unfulfilled demand for those shares because there's not enough supply in some cases. That really points to the fact that underlying all of corporate performance, there is a phenomenon of corporate governance.
Absolutely, sir. I think very valid when you pointed out the fact that beyond the risk lies the opportunities, and it's for the not only the boards but for the management as well to really look at very critically, as to how they are actually assessing the risk on a day-to-day basis. What kind of mitigation plans are they actually building up to prevent their organization from any kind of an uneventful situation that may arise. I think this really sets the tone for the panel discussion that we are going to have now over the next 1.5 hours, wherein we would be deliberating a lot on these issues, on particularly emphasizing on the related party transactions. So with this, I think I'll request my fellow colleague Fatima to come over. And thank you, Mr. Damodaran. Thank you very much for your valuable insights.
Thank you,
Thank you
Saket.
very much. It's really been an honor talking to you. And I think, Fatima, the stage is all set for you to ask or deliberate the panel discussion with the eminent panelists that we have. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Good day. I'll sign off. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Damodaran.
Thank you. Thank you, Fatima.
Thank you. Thanks, Saket, and it was wonderful getting the deep insight from one of the industry stalwarts. With that, I'm Fatima Hunaid. I'm a chartered accountant based in Bangalore, a transfer pricing and related party transaction governance specialist, a couple of decades of experience behind me. And we are here to kind of talk about the practicalities of governing related party transactions and not so much about the technical side of things like interpretation of related party definition or whether there's a transaction or no, but more on the practical side, and how, and also present to you a multi-dimensional view on how people are practically managing in their roles of an independent director or as CFOs, and also representing a few very important sectors like financial services, real estate. So, as we heard in the related party transaction context, there is disparity of information as available with the management or with the company, and as contrasted with the different stakeholders. And this really creates that conflict of interest because of disparity of information mainly. And how to mitigate that? Like Mr. Damodaran mentioned, transparency really would promote fairness in transactions. And an additional dimension which he highlighted is that governance not only creates fairness and transparency on the back of transparency, but also becomes a substantial foundation for success of the company on an ongoing basis, right? So we hope that today's discussion, it's not 1.5 hours like Saket mentioned, it's going to be 60 minutes. We have a range of questions which I'm going to pose to my fellow panelists. And we hope that from the insights you gather on the best practices in different situations of related party transactions, you will be able to perform your roles and gather some insights in terms of what more you can do in promoting governance and fairness in related party transactions in your own situations and facts. With that, I'm delighted to welcome and introduce my fellow panelists, Mr. Vivek N. Gaur. He's an independent director. Mr. Gaur has over 15 years of experience serving on the boards of listed and private companies in US, India, and Middle East. He specializes in chairing the audit and compensation committees and has extensive experience in taking companies public, raising capital, and overseeing corporate governance. Jayesh Jain, my other fellow panelist, is a CFO at Hero FinCorp Limited. He's an experienced CFO with a demonstrated history of working in the financial services industry, skilled in the areas of strategic planning, budgeting, forensic accounting, enterprise risk management, IT governance, fraud control, and regulatory compliance, a host of other skills which I'm not highlighting, only talking about ones that are related to our topic today. Next up is Arvind Maya. He is the Chief Financial Officer at Embassy Office Parks REIT, which is the first listed real estate investment trust. In this capacity, he oversees the entire finance, corporate finance, accounting, and the tax functions. Prior to joining Embassy, Arvind has worked with KPMG for more than 18 years as an audit partner, where he specialized in consumer and the real estate sector. Gaurav Jain, he is an experienced chartered accountant based in Gurgaon. He has extensive experience of advising companies across sectors on transfer pricing and related party transaction governance, including for listed companies. He also sits on the International Tax Committee of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. So with that, I'll kick this discussion off with our first question. And I pose that to Mr. Gaur first. What is the significance of good governance in related party transactions for you? And how do you ensure this in your role as an independent director?
Thank you, Fatima. So first, related party transactions are a core part of good governance. They can't be done away with. They are an essential part of the way businesses run. But as Mr. Damodaran said, they have two parts. One is in the normal course of business, and the other is arm's length pricing, both of which have to be ensured by the board. But good governance on related party transactions does not start at the point when a related party transaction is tabled to the board. It starts much, much earlier in the culture of the board, the culture of the audit committee, and the tone that the independent directors, especially the chair of the audit committee, sets for the company in the way the audit committee is run, in way the private discussions with internal auditors and statutory auditors takes place, in the questions that are asked, that sets the tone in a board of how the management decides to deal with the board on disclosures of related party transactions. And if you don't set that holistic umbrella right, then on the day a related party transaction is being proposed, you're not going to get it right. So that would be my initial response. And of course, the independent director is the gate guardian for related party transactions and setting up a culture where these are disclosed and are discussed and not done by winking and blinking.
Thank you, Mr. Gaur. Insightful. Arvind, how do you see your role and what does good governance in a related party transaction mean to you? A quick response.
I think I'll just add on to what Mr. Gaur said. I think the key metric which tests the strength of good governance in an organization for a normal sale purchase of goods and services, which is in the normal course of business and makes commercial sense for various reasons, is easier to justify for an organization, right? Whereas I would say management needs to be extremely careful when it enters into any capital financing transaction or in the nature of a loan, etc., or a long-term sale purchase of assets. This is where extreme judgment and caution will need to be exercised in justifying the need for such transactions. That would be my incremental view on this.
Great. Thanks, Arvind. Jayesh, for your initial comments and response on this, how do you see your role?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having me. I would actually take a leaf out of what Mr. Gaur said. The tone is actually set at a board and audit committee level. So in terms of a process, I think what Arvind also said, that it cannot be done on an incremental basis as and when it comes. It has to be actually philosophically structured out. There has to be a framework at the start of the year, maybe in terms of a 3-year plan or a strategy that what all kind of a related party transaction can or cannot happen. There should be some thresholds which would be permitted. And yes, the arm's length piece, which Mr. Damodaran also speak and Mr. Gaur also spoke, there has to be that categorical definition or of thresholds that what could be done in terms of a transaction value or a pricing. And incrementally, I would say that in the businesses, related party transactions will happen. And in fact, the way probably I look at it, while it is always looked mostly from a kind of a negative perspective, but it actually gives you a little comfort also in terms of delivery and services and kind of a thing, right? Otherwise, on an open market, probably you would always remain skeptical. You have a little better insight on a related party. But yes, it has to be backed by good paperwork, kind of to give a comfort, clear communication and transparency. So that would be my initial thought. Fatima, back to you.
Great. Thanks, Jayesh, for that. And I think quickly from there, with that context and background, Gaurav, could you please specifically recap the requirements under the current regulations in terms of governance mechanism put into the Companies Act and also contrast it with SEBI regulations?
Sure. Thanks, Fatima. So, there are 3 important governance features in relation to related party transactions. First is approval, second is arm's length determination, and third one is appropriate disclosure. And in India, they are governed primarily by, as you mentioned, Companies Act, SEBI regulations, and also by Income Tax Act to a certain extent. And if we start with Companies Act, Section 188 provides for prior approval from Board of Directors by way of a resolution from board meeting in respect of specified transactions in relation to related parties. However, no such approval is required if the transaction are in ordinary course of business and at an arm's length price. Further, a prior approval is mandatory from shareholders in case certain class of transactions, related party transactions, breaches threshold. If we now come to listed and other public companies, Section 177 requires that all kind of transactions need a prior approval from audit committee. So what is important here to note is that Section 188 is only in respect of specified transaction versus Section 177, which requires audit committee approval for all kind of transactions. This is the approval process, and the disclosure under Companies Act is all companies need to disclose in their board's report particulars of related party contracts. Also, they need to mention about the transactions which are not at arm's length price and details of all material related party transactions. If we now move to SEBI regulations, as you know that all listed companies need to adhere with SEBI regulations. They require us first to obtain prior approval from audit committee in relation to all related party transactions. Then they again need to obtain shareholder approval in relation to certain class of transaction if it breaches the threshold. In case of omnibus approval, which is for your typically for routine transaction, you also need to obtain an annual approval. These are approval processes. If we come to the disclosure under SEBI, first and foremost, all companies needs to have a related party policy in place, which needs to be there on the website, along with a link of this website in their annual report. Further, a quarterly compliance report need to be submitted with the the stock exchange, which will have details of material related party transaction, and this needs to be submitted within 15 days of each quarter. Finally, there is for all your biannual reports and annual financial reports, you need to have disclosure of all related parties in adherence with applicable accounting standard. So this is with SEBI. And finally, Income Tax Act, and the reason I also wanted to mention Income Tax Act is because it deals with related party transactions in great detail, which requires all your international transactions and certain class of domestic transaction to be at arm's length price. All the companies need to obtain a certificate from chartered accountant with a certification that the transaction are at arm's length price, and that needs to be filed annually along with your income tax return. So, in summary, these are the prescribed disclosures, compliances, and approval in relation to related party transactions.
Thank you, Gaurav, for that. So, on one hand, like Mr. Damodaran mentioned, the Companies Act is quite trusting. There is an approval required only for not ordinary course or not arm's length transaction, and takes that approach, school of thought, to related party transactions, that they are mostly beneficial for companies. Whereas in the case of SEBI, there's an approval required for all transactions. By way of context, according to OECD, almost 80 to 85% of global trade is intra-group transactions. And that just underlines the fact and the importance of good governance in the context of related party transactions, and also, you must be aware of base erosion and profit shifting regulations of the OECD and G20, covering almost 140 countries across the world, and why this is so very, very important and needs to be in the top 3 agenda items of the board. Having said that, Mr. Damodaran also did mention and highlight that our disclosure requirements in India are more comprehensive in letter. In spirit is something what we will discuss and see more as we go along in this discussion. To my mind, when I look at the disclosure norms and the approval norms, these are a couple of initial enablers that are there, and to my mind there'll be a lot more required by way of best practices and guidance, so that each of the stakeholders able to perform, especially the management and the board and the audit committee, is able to discharge their roles more holistically. Jayesh, talking of enablers, coming to you, you referred to in one of our prior discussions about a new SEBI circular around credit rating agencies needing to consult with audit committees, and if you could throw more light on the nature and context coverage of that circular.
Sure, thanks, Fatima. So last year, and in fact, before I speak about this circular, I think last couple of years have seen a little bit of issues in our financial services sector, primarily because of our related party transactions. And it had an impact on a lot of stakeholders, retail shareholders, and debt holders also. So SEBI last year came up with a direction and asked credit rating agencies to speak to audit committee once in at least a year. So that was a requirement which came in last November. And primarily their expectation on a discussion with audit committee was around two major aspects. One, most importantly, and we have discussed and heard from Mr. Damodaran also, that related party transaction, how important it is in a business, and good governance is required around that. So related party transaction, and then the another was around internal financial control. So the way, and the third thing was any other material disclosure or which can have an impact on rating. So primarily, if you look at the first two aspects, they are kind of internal link, internal financial control and related party. And the discussion primarily, it is required primarily because while there are a lot of disclosure requirement, but in terms of information available and given by the companies in annual report are not that very, very descriptive. So a lot of reports which I studied, and a lot of, I'm sure you would have also studied that, a lot of time, instead of giving individual company names, they will say investment or transactions with the associate companies or a subsidiary company, not naming what all are there. Now, within that framework or within that kind of a disclosures, rating agencies would always have a little kind of a gap in terms of interpreting the transaction. So that's where the rating agencies would be wanting or have been asked to discuss with audit chair. What is the framework? What is the philosophy on related party transaction? How do they see it? And yes, few of the things which we spoke about and Mr. Gaur spoke about is how do audit committee exercise control on whether it is in an ordinary course of business and at arm's length. So that discussion actually would little help credit rating agencies in assessing the credit worthiness of company and then give the rating, which then can be used by the stakeholders.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jayesh, for that. It kind of also throws light on what one can expect more to come, and more real-time enablers being put in to help, various people discharge their roles holistically. And in that context, Mr. Gaur, coming to you next. Now, due to various reasons, many cases have come up that highlight, which have led to erosion of shareholder wealth, for on the back of which there have been a spate of auditor resignations in this decade as well. The mention of related party transactions in itself, creates a shade of doubt in the minds of people. We heard about how it can be beneficial, etc. But having said that, this is the reality, that the mention of related party transactions in itself creates that kind of mindset in stakeholders that are not privy to this kind of information. So what has been your experience on the boards? Are these transactions that you have come across mostly beneficial or not? For example, transactions could be beneficial if they sit right on the value chain, either by way of forward or backward integration. So your thoughts on these, please.
Thank you, Fatima. So I'll go in reverse order of the questions which you have raised. First, whether related party transactions are beneficial or not. Honestly done related party transactions, which are part of forward integration, backward integration, or access to technology, are beneficial to a company. Companies often grow through acquisitions, and those automatically then become related parties. But dealing with your acquired entity is a part of your own growth strategy. However, in India, the word related party transaction has acquired a negative connotation, and both companies as well as the government bureaucracy are to be blamed for this, because we have had companies misusing the freedom they have to run their business using public money to either enrich the stakeholders like Vijay Mallya and company, or to fudge the books of accounts in order to show a higher market value and a higher positioning on the sort of corporate sweepstakes like Satyam, and several others in between. Now, no amount of law or independent director supervision is going to do away with the intent to commit a criminal act. No, you cannot legislate it away, and you cannot eliminate it through procedures. There has to be a fundamental intent to run the company properly and to run it well to start with. If that itself is missing, then related party transaction is only one of many routes to misuse shareholder wealth or to deplete shareholder wealth. For each of us individually, either as employees or as directors, it behooves us to do our homework properly for a company we are about to join in terms of a proper due diligence, to sort of know what are the ethics, what are the standards, what are the values the organization pursues. For myself personally, I have always done a full forensic audit with the help of a leading audit firm on any company whose board I join. And even then, I had one case about a decade ago, which is today a famous company, but was less well known then, where I went for the first board meeting. I had been invited there on behest of their shareholders. And I was surprised at the tone and texture of the discussion. Nothing illegal was discussed, but it was very clear to me what direction this company was going. And I resigned from the board at the end of that board meeting. And what I have seen happening in the 10 years since sort of justifies my decision to have stayed away. In India, we consider stakeholder related party as a negative thing, while in reality, as Aditya mentioned, it helps bridge a trust deficit in a country where contracts are difficult to enforce, payments are difficult to collect, integrity is difficult to enforce. So we should encourage, I would say, honest related party transactions, which are in the normal course of business at a fair price, and not look down on them. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Gaur. I'm sure it's very authentic feedback from your side on that question, and valuable there, Mr. Gaur. Thank you. Arvind, coming to you next. The REIT regulations are relatively new, the real estate investment trust regulations. And you're one of the first ones in that sense to really be complying with the requirements. So how did you go about preparing and about complying with relatively new regulations? There is no precedent, at least in India back then. And specifically, what were the key aspects that you gave priority to with regard to related party transaction governance?
Thanks, Fatima. Let me start with some background. Effectively, the REIT regulations which are provided by SEBI provides pretty detailed guidance on the do's and don'ts in relation to a related party. The reason for that is that the REIT regs recognize that there can be constant related party transactions in this structure, and hence SEBI has put out such robust guidelines. Now, at a very high level, for the benefit of the audience here, REITs across globe grows through acquisition, and one common mode of acquisition is from sponsors. If I were to just take our case as an example, the Embassy Group is a developer entity which is involved in development of greenfield assets, which have a higher risk-return ratio. And once developed and stabilized, it would look to sell such assets to the REIT for cash or swap, because REIT as a concept will look to hold only stable assets, right? So because of this, the REIT regulations mandate minimum of 2 valuation reports for any sale purchase of assets from a related party. Plus, it says that the price which we pay cannot exceed more than 10% of the average of the 2 valuers. Plus, it says that any purchase in excess of 10% of the value of assets of the REIT requires unit holders approval, and the related parties cannot vote in that. And even from a board perspective, it's only the independent directors which can approve, right? So if I were to just relook at the recent deal which we did as a REIT, which is public knowledge and hence I can disclose, what we did was we did all of this, all of the above which I mentioned. But more importantly, since we are the first REIT and this was a significant acquisition, first acquisition, we did refer to global benchmarks, global best practices to see what else do people do, right? So what we ended up doing was, in addition to these two independent valuers, we also got a fairness opinion from a well-reputed merchant banker, even though this was not at all required as per regulations, which justified that the price which we are paying is fair to the external unit holders, right? So if I were to summarize what becomes important for us to assess when you're new in any field is how can we adopt best practices or create best practices around related party governance. When you look at our normal day-to-day transactions, leaving aside these one-time big, large transactions, what we did was, whether a transaction is small or big, we benchmark every single transaction using a third-party consultant. We specifically reviewed each and every transactions, or rather got the transactions reviewed by our internal auditors for compliance with the whole host of things which Gaurav mentioned, be it our internal policy, Companies Act, REIT regulations, the listing obligation disclosure regulations. So I think it's in summary, it's going beyond what is required under regulations when you're starting new. That would be my summary.
Fantastic, Arvind, and a shining example of somebody who would talk on the best practices, and you're doing the best of whatever you can think of doing and setting benchmarks, so to speak. And on that same breath, I'd like to come back to you with another question, that having done all of this, what's been your experience with SEBI? Are they really active, and what kind of experience do you have in the context of related party transaction reviews?
Yeah, so I'll keep that short, Fatima. But since REITs are relatively new, what happened was SEBI did a pretty extensive inspection, if I can say, more so to understand, since this is the first REIT and it's a new product, new regulations, they really wanted to come and look at us and see how we are going about implementing the regulations which they had put out. So they wanted to understand how practical these policies are. Does it really make sense? Are we facing challenges? So it was honestly a pretty open discussion. They didn't really come to find faults. They looked at what all we were doing, which are the areas where we are facing the challenge. They took some notes back to their committee to see how they can simplify certain regulations, right? But in their entire, I would say they spent 4 days, close to 75% of the time they spent reviewing all the related party transactions. And what they went about doing was to also check completeness of disclosure, right? So for that, they went to the extent where they said, we would want a print of all your general ledgers, right? We said printing general ledger across transactions is just impossible. So then finally they took soft copy of our general ledger for the entire period, because they wanted to review for themselves to see, are there some transactions which are not disclosed by us, right? So they went to that extent. So if I were to summarize from that experience, what is required, for us as an organization is, it's not good enough if we just do certain practices, policies, but those are not documented. It becomes very, very important to document the thought process, the logic, rationale behind entering into any transaction, so that be it any company's internal memos on why we are doing a related party, what's the logic, the third party benchmarking reports, how detailed are related parties approved and documented in the agenda papers of audit committee and board, as well as minutes of meeting. I think each one of these are very, very important, because you might do whatever you might do, but if it's not documented, it doesn't help when a regulator looks at it. So I think that's my submission on this point.
Great. Thank you so much, Arvind, and for highlighting the need for real-time contemporaneous documentation. That's also one of the tenets that Mr. Damodaran referred to. Mr. Gaur, coming to you next. So SEBI has a levy of penalty to ensure, one of the things to ensure governance. So is the levy of penalty by SEBI an effective deterrent, and in that sense also encouraging good governance on the part of listed companies? If not, what do you believe would be more effective to, in one sense, compel good governance in related party transactions, more disclosures, better arm's length benchmarks, etc.?
Thank you, Fatima. So first, the fees, the penalties are a deterrent, but depending upon the degree of the penalty and the attitude of the management, the degree of deterrence could be limited. Naming and shaming of directors involved is actually a more compelling route, because at the end of the day, a director is more concerned about his personal reputation than anything else. And as Mr. Damodaran said, in letter, our rules and disclosure requirements are actually quite good, and in fact quite high, and I really don't see any reason to dilute them. And to be fair, since I started sitting on large boards in 2002, there has been a light years of change in the way Indian boards run, in the way Indian directors and promoters in listed companies especially view compliance and governance. Few want to cut corners in listed companies. There are always exceptions, but let's talk about the 2/3 who do comply. And I think all of this is for the better. In some part, organizations like income tax continue to view the business sector as the enemy who have to be beaten into place all the time, which is rather sad and an outdated way of thinking. But on the whole, I think we have come a very long way. In fact, when I compare disclosures in Indian companies with disclosures in British or American companies whose boards I've sat on, we are far ahead actually. You can get away with murder in many a British company depending upon how it is structured. But in India, if you're a public company listed or not, pretty much the same rules apply to you, other than what SEBI might sort of give for listed companies in addition.
Thank you, Mr. Gaur. Very insightful again. The global perspective is also, kind of puts things in context there. Gaurav, coming to you next. Now, since you have experience in auditing related party transactions and benchmarks, especially, where appointed by independent directors for the comfort of the board, what has been your experience in the level of documentation? The point which Arvind referred to, the depth of the documentation and the reliability of the benchmarks that often management presents to us.
Sure. So Fatima, each company has its own vision, level of governance and priorities. Consequently, their policy framework also differ. For example, a startup company, for them focusing to establish their business may be more vital. In such situation, the company may not have robust documentation in relation to related party transactions due to the fact that they don't have either enough resources to manage the framework or that's not their priority. So our approach in such cases is to establish benchmarks using comparable data, have intercompany agreements and other backup documents to be in place. If we talk about a firm which is up and running and has appropriate related party policies and implementation in place, however, a potential challenge in these cases may be that given the consistent nature of related party transactions, the policies governing them haven't been overhauled periodically. So in such cases, our approach is to understand the facts if there has been any change in the substance of transaction. And in that case, the supporting documents, including benchmarking data, is to be updated accordingly. Now we come to big players who is well established and has been in system for many years. These companies have robust governance framework and comply with all the requirements. However, such companies may have unique transactions which may not have readily available market prices or comparable prices. Our approach in this case is to understand the facts in detail of such related party transaction and justify the same both from economic and business rationale, and to the extent available third party prices. Our reliance in such cases would be on agreements, email communications, process followed for awarding contracts, and benefits emanating from them. So, in my opinion, there may not be a specific set of documents that may be uniformly applied to all conditions and all companies. What is important is to maintain all relevant documents that clearly exhibit this selection of related party as a preferred party to transact with.
Very relevant and insightful points there, Gaurav, from practical experience. And while I agree there can't be uniformity across companies, but certainly there are best practices which each company should try and ensure while documenting the basis of related party selection and the pricing thereof. Jayesh and Arvind, coming to you now, there seems to be an emerging issue on the identification or missing out on identification of related parties. There's also a question in the Q&A where Peter has asked one of our attendees on what is the definition. We are not covering the definition, Peter, here, but just to mention that under different laws, there is a wide definition of related parties, so much so that at times there is this issue emerging on non-identification of related parties. So, Jayesh, why do you think this is an issue? And if you could throw more light on the challenges on the ground in identification of related parties, and what could be the best practice?
Thanks, Fatima. I think considering the way businesses are expanding to the geographies and a lot of stakeholders, a lot of vendors which are getting hired for services, and at an employee level, at a KMP level, at a board level, a lot of conglomerates are there. So it definitely becomes very, very difficult at the time of a vendor enrollment to link whether the particular vendor is a related party or not. So I think the way to go about, and that could be one reason where considering the numerous business transaction, the good governance, the related party. In fact, I would, in our organization, we go beyond the related party transaction in the context of the statute, which is what Companies Act say, and probably from a promoter perspective or control perspective. Even at a employee level also, we try and have that philosophy that somewhere if there is a relation, we should be taking an objective call and trying to dissuade from that kind of engagement. And if at all we have to do, then probably you should disclose and probably have someone else try and make a judgment on the smallest of the service contract. Maybe it could be 100,000 rupees or 500,000 rupees. So the way to probably at a larger level to go about is probably one thing which we have been trying to do with our senior management and top 100 people who could be influencers, a lot of training. So we have an annual training kind of a schedule with all employees, the key employees, and trying to share with them the expectation on a related party transaction, the expectation on their engagement with vendor selection processes. And we maintain a database where someone like me as a CFO, I'm a KMP. What all interest or what all relatives I have, that is there on a system. And then the PAN numbers, the GST numbers, if I'm on a board of someone, there would be some PAN number or some GST number which could be there. And then system helps us flag it as and when it goes into a kind of a system for a payment or a purchase order. It throws that kind of flag that it is a related party transaction. So something like that, definitely with the help of system, with creating probably a database, if not system, probably on Excel file, which someone manages, and all the vendor or all the transactions are run pass through. So essentially, I'll say that it is that extra care to ensure that you are not stepping on the wrong side of law, which actually helps you manage that. And yes, there is a little bit of effort, but can be very well done.
Perfect. Thanks, Jayesh. Arvind?
I think Jayesh captured it pretty comprehensively, but one background and just one follow-up point. I think one of the reasons why the identification of a related party could get complex is because each statute, each regulation has its own small nuance of change in the definition, like the Companies Act definition versus the Ind AS definition versus, in our case, the REIT regulation definition is not consistent. So when you get into interpretation of these regulations, there is a high chance that you will interpret that one company is not a related party, and hence you will exclude it. But another person's interpretation might be that it is a related party, right? So my perspective on that, at least this is what we do as an organization, is even if it's related by a remote extent, we disclose it as a related party. The typical examples where it can get complicated is when it's not a subsidiary, when you have a stake of 10%, 15% or bordering 20%. Under some definitions, it might not fall within the definition of a related party because it's held by a promoter and not by a company, right? So the best thing to do is just disclose it as a related party. That would be one view. And second is, each and every large organization needs to, have robust, I would say, ERP systems. Like what we are trying to do, I'm not saying we've done it, what we're trying to do is every single related party as a company or a LLP or a sole proprietor is tagged as a related party in our SAP system, so that whenever there is a PR or a PO raise, I'm talking about practicalities now, we know that it's a related party, number one. Number two, if there is no pre-approval by audit committee, then you can't do a purchase requisition on that entity, right? So that kind of builds in the practical element of ensuring that you don't enter into a related party even inadvertently. I would say that's a practical measure which companies can do over and above all the identification aspects.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Arvind. Very useful insight there. Coming to you, Mr. Gaur, in your experience as an independent director, how do you satisfy yourself that the management would have identified all the possible related parties and all the possible related party transactions?
So coming back to what I had said earlier and taking a leaf out of what Aravind has just said, the first step is to identify all potential related parties, which you must get the management to do. Corporates, partnerships, and individuals, relatives, companies in which the relatives work, etc. And tag them in the accounting system, in the purchase and sales system, so that if and when a transaction crops up, it pops up automatically. The second is the kind of relationship the audit committee sets up with the CFO, the controller, the company secretary, internal auditor, stat auditor, and the private meetings we have with them. As I said, you cannot legislate away criminal intent, but short of criminal intent, if the person, basically wishes to run a good business, then a conversation privately, looking the person in the eye, does address at least 90% of the issue of whether a related party transaction is being deliberately hidden or being done outside the policy that has already been set. And of course, the policy needs to be set in a practical way, which may say that, figures below 1 lakh rupee are to be ignored, or some appropriate number. And that is how, through building a bond of human relationships, as well as using technology of identifiable PAN numbers, is the route to make sure that you don't have related party transactions that are slipping past you deliberately or by mistake.
So, Mr. Gaur, do you often seek also any external validation, like Arvind mentioned, through any external independent consultant or auditor?
We have done it only a few times in my experience, especially where it involved transfer pricing between a company in India and its associate abroad. Mainly done to keep compliance with income tax regulations, as well as to stay on the right side of FEMA and not to have unfair pricing. However, if you have experts on the board, amongst your independents especially, who understand that particular industry well, then a cursory glance of the terms and conditions will directionally tell you in an instant whether this is a sort of fair pricing, broadly speaking, or is it completely whacked out.
Thank you, Mr. Gaur. That's useful. Arvind, coming to you now. Um, uh, Now you talked a lot about different aspects of unique transaction, first time regulation, etc. And also you talked about having you know this approach of being conservative, over disclosure versus under disclosure, etc. Having done all of that, do you face any challenge? And if you could talk about the challenges which one might face as management in still getting these transactions past the board, past the independent, past the audit committee, I think that would be very useful.
Yeah, Fatima, I think that's the reality of any business, right? Because there is an element of judgment involved in a lot of transactions. Now, when we look at certain transactions where the goods or services are provided only by a related party, that's probably because that particular related party might be the best suited to provide the quality of service or goods which is required for that company. Such kind of transactions might not necessarily have a direct comparable, right? But having said that, when you can't find a direct comparable, what becomes important is to understand how the specific related party has contributed to the overall margins, right? I mean, this really depends on a case by case basis. If you are a company which is into trading business, it might be very easy for you to kind of, identify the whole sequence of transactions and see what's the overall margin. However, if it's a smaller component or a smaller service in the overall product service, it becomes very important to assess whether the end product, the end service is making margins. And when you benchmark those margins to overall company level or segment level margins, it's justifiable, right? The other way you typically do is if this related party also does transactions with unrelated party, can you get hold of certain supporting documents which justifies the price? Uh, yes, we do face challenges sometimes in justifying to the board why it is at arm's length, but I think that is where consultants like you, I think Fatima, come into picture because you have the experience of looking at the overall market, not just in India, overall across the globe. You will be able to somewhere find a methodology, right, to justify whether this transaction is at arm's length or not. To kind of wind up, all I can say is that if, as just taking a leaf out of what Mr. Gaur said, which is about intention. If the intention of management is right, if a related party transaction is a genuine transaction, we will always be able to justify how it is at arm's length. If not, we'll always fall short. I think that's my summary.
Thank you so much, Arvind, for that candid, feedback on that. Jayesh, now coming to you, the financial services sector really has been a hotbed of all kinds of issues and of a scale one would not have imagined earlier. So, in that context, I'm sure this has put a lot of pressure on the management, on the various stakeholders in the financial services sector in trying to ensure fairness, transparency across all dimensions, not just related party transactions, but more so in the context of related party transactions, right? So, how have you seen your role evolve and change, and if you could highlight also what is your own perspective on, is too much going on? Do you have a sense of how much is too much in terms of disclosure, transparency, documentation, etc.? So over to you.
Thanks, Fatima. So before I little comment on this, I think there is a little saying kind of a thing. You judge yourself by your intent and others by your their action. So something like this actually also goes into related party. So while as a company, if you are doing a related party transaction, you would always have that intent that I'm doing right, I am unbiased, I am objective, it is in the ordinary course of business, it is at arm's length, and so on and so forth. But then you will be judged by others by the action which we take. So in fact, lot has been already spoken by Mr. Kaur, Arvind and Gaurav in terms of a process documentation and objectivity. So that's where a lot comes. And as a KMT, probably the role and responsibility, apart from ensuring the first two aspects which we spoke in terms of ordinary course of business and arm's length, where ensuring that something which is happening is part of your normal business. It is not an exceptional. We being a finance company probably cannot go and acquire a property, which is something which is not a natural transaction to us, or start dealing in a goods and services. So that kind of a long lens would always be there. And then arm's length, you get 2-3 vendors, you figure it out objectively, take help of firms like yours, Gaurav, and then figure it out that what could be the arm's length. But then probably most important is that the paperwork and communication, which is what Mr. Damodaran also spoke at the outset. And I think a lot of the problem can happen and has been happening because of a unclear communication, incomplete communication. So that's where engagement with the stakeholders, disclosures in the annual report, which will actually help a little bit of a building trust and transparency. And the transactions which are in a normal course would not be viewed as a colored transaction. So I think it's something which we spoke for some time now. The communication, the documentation, the process. That's what if you can show your intent on action, it would be great. And yes, with a lot of problems which has happened, these are now being looked microscopically. So the onus is on the KMPs to ensure that there is a clear paperwork and a clear communication. Back to you, Fatima.
Thanks, Jayesh. So do you also believe there remains a shade of gray in spite of all the documentation, etc., where it may not be possible to quantify, but qualitatively it is possible to justify?
No, indeed, there would always be a shade of gray. This is the financial transaction or any transaction of a sale, purchase, loan, interest cannot be binary. So no two companies would have a similar kind of, even at a similar rating, there could be different perspective. So two PSUs, you take it PFC or ONGC, a AAA kind of a rating, but then in terms of assessment, financials, there could be different strengths and weaknesses, and the pricing would be different, which is actually there. Same goes for your goods and services, Big Four, your firm comparison, the kind of a people which comes in for the services. So how do you justify those kind of related party transaction? I taking a quote from two parties and trying to do a related party transaction and then justifying a 50 paisa more on a goods or services or a 25 paisa less on a purchase transaction would always be a little bit of a subjective. But yes, I think again, as I said, that if on an intent side, the paperwork side and process side, if you could prove it, the regulators and the auditors and the stakeholders would probably take it more kind of positively. But any absence of it, you say that I did not took a competitive code, you are definitely like stepping on a landmine.
Great, thanks, Jayesh, for that additional insight. I would like to come to you, Mr. Gaur. I think we've spoken a lot about management, board. A bit about the shareholder perspective will also be useful. And to that extent, to your mind, how influential or effective are large investor groups and other institutional investor groups in ensuring monitoring. See, finally, the approval onus is given to shareholders. If some conditions are not met or not in ordinary course, not arm's length, no benchmark available. So how effective is that? Do you think they have enough knowledge or wherewithal to be actually, approving that transaction, or are they able to discharge the role?
A lot depends upon who is the actual nominee director from the institution on that board, and how knowledgeable is that person, and what kind of personality of assertiveness that person has, and to what extent is the institution given him or her a free hand or reined them in. And I'll give you two examples here. We all know about the ILFS fiasco, which happened despite the fact that there were several nominees from institutions on that board and independents of, very reputable backgrounds. But those nominees sat there as Donald Ducks, actually, not exercising their brain power and not being assertive where they needed to be. At the same time, I have personally experienced in public sector organizations which have certain nominees from other banking institutions or government arms exercising significant degree of independent thought on what should be done and should not be done, in a very, very thoroughly professional fashion. So just because a nominee is from a large institution, Indian or foreign, does not automatically improve anything unless the person on the spot has the experience and the character to be able to speak up.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mr. Gaur. And actually not sitting ineffectually in spite of having all of that faculty, but actually also exercise those faculties. Thank you for that, Mr. Gaur. And I think in the interest of time, Gaurav, the last question I have, I'll pose it to you. Back to benchmarking, so especially what kind of challenges you think COVID has put out there for companies being able to reliably benchmark, right? Because the current transaction values and the data that is available is all past, which is before COVID hit. So if you could throw some light in terms of what best practice that companies can adopt.
Sure. Thanks, Fatima. And I'm mindful of time and I'll keep it crisp. Of course, COVID-19 has had a pervasive impact practically on everything. The way things work in business have undergone a sea change. That's a fact. Arm's length price is measured as an index of profitability earned or price charged by independent market players. However, due to relaxation given to corporates by way of extending the timelines to file their financials has posed additional challenge. As you all are aware, finding right comparables, any which case was a challenge. This has further added to the problem. And in top of it, each company has their own problem, either in way of incurring exceptional costs, abnormal costs, working much below capacity. So really comparing one company with the other without undertaking appropriate adjustment will be very difficult to do that.
Thanks, we're just at time. So I think I'll kind of summarize it as, while public data will be available next year, it's very important to contemporaneously document, put down reasons on how COVID at least has impacted your transactions and try and make adjustments as close to reality as possible. I would like to thank each and every panelist for sharing transparently their insights from practical experience. And we have a list of questions. Please be assured we will come back to you with our perspective and have those all responded to as soon as possible. Thank you very much. And we hope this was useful.